I am the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I want to explain how Robert Kane argues for libertarian free will. A professor of philosophy, Robert Kane has been thinking about the question of free will since the 1960s. Kane is a free will libertarian, that is, a person who believes that human beings possess free will. He defines free will as the power to be the ultimate creator and sustainer of one's own ends or purposes. In his 1996 book, The Significance of Free Will, he defends the concept of free will by attempting to answer 4 questions on compatibility, significance, intelligibility, and the existence of free will. On compatibility, he asks, is free will compatible with determinism? His answer is no. On significance, he asks, why is such a kind of incompatible free will important to us? Why do we want to possess such a kind of free will? On intelligibility, he asks, how can we understand free will? Is such an understanding coherent and intelligible, or must it be mysterious and incomprehensible? On existence, he asks, does free will exist in the natural order, and if so, where? He presents a set of 91 theses to defend libertarian free will, through which he explains why free will is more than what compatibilists regard as freedom. He argues that whatever problems are left in the analysis must be problems that are not just artifacts of libertarian theory, but problems that other positions on free will will have to also contend with, namely the cosmological problems of consciousness and indeterminacy in nature. To answer these cosmological problems, he suggests a possible biological mechanism incorporating quantum uncertainty and its effects on neural networks as a possible natural underpinning of free will. To understand his theory on libertarian free will, he first explains 2 concepts central to free will debates. The first is the principle of alternate possibilities, where freedom in choice entails that agents can have the power or ability to choose to perform an action or otherwise. The second is devised by Kane, on ultimate responsibility. The phrase ultimate responsibility comprises 2 terms, responsibility and the ultimate nature of this responsibility, meaning where the final responsibility falls for one's particular acts. To be clear, an act is where one did something or refrained from doing something such that an event occurred or was prevented from occurring. On responsibility, an agent is personally responsible for an outcome if the agent voluntarily or willingly did or causally contributed to the occurrence of an event and could have done otherwise, which would have made a difference to the occurrence of the event. On ultimacy, if an agent is responsible for an event, then the agent is responsible for the cause or explanation of the event. Ultimate responsibility is the conjunction of these 2 ideas. An agent is ultimately responsible if she voluntarily or willingly did or caused the event, while having the possibility to have done otherwise, and is responsible for the cause of the event. To understand why Kane had to make clear what seem like obvious definitions, we need to know what the positions in the free will debate are that are opposed to libertarianism. These other positions are determinism and compatibilism. Determinism is where everything that happens is determined because of the ineluctable law of nature of cause and effect. Determinists and compatibilists argue that an agent can still voluntarily act and yet be determined to act in that way due to prior causes, and if the chain of cause and effects are traced to their ultimate source, that it is not a human will that is the ultimate cause, but some other cause like the initial arrangement of atoms when the universe was newly formed. Compatibilists make the additional distinction that in the compatibilist universe, people have the freedom to do what they want to do, even though what they want to do has already been determined by prior causes. In that universe, you may have alternate possibilities with nothing preventing you from taking them, but you will choose what prior causes had determined you to choose. Nonetheless, since you were not coerced to choose the way you chose, and thus were free to choose the way you wanted, you are responsible for your choices. This is where libertarians and compatibilists part ways. Libertarians argue that if you are not the ultimate cause of your choices and actions, you could not be morally responsible for them. Hence Kane, a libertarian, posits that free will requires alternate possibilities and ultimate responsibility. While compatibilism allows for human freedom, such freedom is not sufficient to constitute free will. To have free will, agents must have, at some point in their lives, have had the possibility of choice and of freely deciding. Some of these decisions will be character forming for the agents, which would shape the kind of person that they are. Not all decisions have to be free ones. The example that Kane gives is where Martin Luther stood his ground. Luther was summoned to the Diet of Worms in 1521 on charges of heresy. He was asked to recant his writings and teachings, including the infamous 95 Theses, which he nailed to the doors of his church. He replied, "My conscience is captive to the word of God. This I cannot and will not recant, because acting against one's conscience is neither safe nor sound. Here I stand, I can do no other. God help me." He is saying that he has no choice but to do as he did. However, this is not because his actions were determined. Luther had at some earlier point in his life been confronted with a decision on the kind of person he wants to be. Let's call this decision D1. If he had resolutely decided then the next time he faces a similar decision, D2, he already knows the choice he is going to make. D2 was in that way determined. Yet, he is ultimately responsible for D2, since if we trace back D2's cause, it will lead us back to D1, where he was free to decide and decided as he did. Kane postulates that if free will exists, there must be some points in an agent's life history where decisions are undetermined. In the case of Luther, it was D1, where he could have still chosen another way than to stick to his principles and beliefs. Kane calls the actions at these points self-forming actions. What are self-forming actions? Self-forming actions are the undetermined regress-stopping voluntary actions or refrainings in the life histories of agents that are required if ultimacy is to be satisfied, and for which the agent is personally responsible, writes Kane. The agents are responsible for those actions. It is at these self-forming actions that the buck stops. Not all actions are self-forming ones, like during Luther's "Here I Stand" speech, where his stance was already formed or determined. However, Kane will say that in Luther's case, we can keep tracing back Luther's life history, finding earlier and earlier causes until finally we find a self-forming action, where we can stop our search for the origin of Luther's later "Here I Stand" action, which was a determined action. So not every action has to be free ones, since some actions can arise from earlier self-forming actions, which will then determine later ones. For libertarians, there must have been some self-forming actions done out of an agent's free will at some point in an agent's life history, which will make the agent ultimately responsible. Later acts can then be traced back to these self-forming actions. Libertarians who agree with the account so far will still need to explain where these self-forming actions come from. They had previously done so by invoking entities that are only required in libertarian theories, more well-known ones being mind-body duality and non-occurrent agent causation. Kane thinks, however, that creating such entities is a poor methodological approach, since such entities obfuscate what instead needs to be explained, casting a mystery on free will rather than elucidating what it is. What would be a legitimate move will be to use entities that are also needed by non-libertarian theories. The only difference will then be that these entities will be undetermined in libertarian accounts, while they will be determined in determinist and compatibilist accounts. Kane terms this the free agency principle, which is simply a specific instance of Occam's razor applied to free will debates. Kane equates the freedom of the agent to the freedom of the agent's will. Self-forming actions are free willings by the agent, that is, self-forming willings, which are undetermined until they become determined by the agent's will. These acts of the will are acts that take place in the agent's mind, that is, mental acts. They bring about or sustain intentions, purposes, and beliefs, which then guide the agent's physical actions. They are motivated by desires and inclinations, requiring forming, altering, and sustaining the intentions and beliefs, and take effort to carry out. Compatibilists can agree to this since they too believe that mental acts exist, except that for them, these acts are effects from previous causes such as other thoughts, emotions, or external factors which determine the decisions of the agent. Non-compatibilists would say that self-forming willings come from the agent's free will, and until the will has determined them, were undetermined. Self-forming willings fall into two categories: free judgments of the will and striving will. Free judgments of the will include moral choices, prudential choices, and practical judgments, while striving will are attentional efforts required for self-control, self-modification, and changes of intention during action. Moral choices are between acting morally or acting out of self-interest. Prudential choices are between acting for the sake of future benefits or for the sake of present ones. Self-forming willings of the moral and prudential categories are characterized by inner conflicts and struggle within the wills of agents between the various alternatives, at which point the agent's decision is still undetermined. What is happening within the mental struggle draws from the agent's character, experiences, and reasoning. While they influence his will, they do not necessarily determine it. Kane suggests a possible biological mechanism for this decision-making process. At the subatomic or quantum level, there are indeterminacies in the state of the fundamental particles. While these indeterminacies tend to cancel out at a macro level, that is not true for chaotic systems, which are sensitive to initial conditions. Such chaotic systems amplify quantum indeterminacies. The brain may be a chaotic system comprised of neural networks formed by connections between neurons. Quantum indeterminacies may be present at a neuronal level, which are then amplified by the chaotic processes of the mind, making the neural networks sensitive to quantum indeterminacies at the neuronal level. While the agent is having a mental struggle or making an effort of will, this tension causes some parts of his brain to shift further from thermodynamic equilibrium, making it more sensitive to quantum indeterminacies at the neuronal level, which is then magnified through chaotic brain processes. While Kane draws these concepts from the scientific literature, we should remember that this mechanism is merely a hypothesis. What Kane is doing is suggesting a possible mechanism to explain indeterminacy in our biology, which corresponds to the uncertainty we experience as efforts of our free will as we try to come to a decision. He is in effect trying to explain a source of indeterminacy in nature so as to disarm determinism. We should note that quantum indeterminacy is not pure randomness. It is a probability distribution governed by a law, Schrodinger's wave equation. When agents are torn between conflicting visions of what they should become, the outcomes are influenced by, but not determined by, past motives and character, writes Kane. More on the biological mechanism will follow, but first Kane explains his concept of plural rational control. Returning to the moments when self-forming actions take place, Kane proposes that they had a plural rationality or motivation. There are alternatives to the choice of action such that each alternative has its own rationality, which is incommensurate with the rationality of the other alternatives. To clarify plural rationality, Kane first provides an example of what it is not. A sniper aims to hit her target. She could miss, but when she misses, it is not because she wanted to miss as an expression of her will, but it was by chance or mistake that she missed. She did not choose to miss. When she does hit the target, it is an expression of her will since she had wanted to hit the target. In the case of plural rationality, the alternatives are both attractive in their own ways. Kane illustrates the concept with an example of a businesswoman on the way to seal a deal at a meeting which takes place soon. If she misses the meeting, the deal falls through. She passes by a person being assaulted in an alley. She feels morally compelled to stop to help the victim, but that will take some time, by which time she will have missed her crucial meeting. She is conflicted because she also has the self-interest to seal that deal. Both options have their attractions, the first to do what is morally right and the second to make the money. The reasons for either option are incommensurable. They are reasoning about different things, the first being moral, the second being self-interested. Whichever she chooses will be rational, since both options have their own reasons to recommend them. If she chooses to go to her business meeting and disregard the assault, she may be failing morally but succeeding financially, and vice versa. Whichever she finally chooses is an expression of her will. Let's say she decides to stop to help. However morally upright she is, if we examine her psyche, she may have had some doubts. If she did not, there would be no conflict. She might as well be a moral robot. She was conflicted because while she may wish to be morally upright, her moral desires are not the only desires that matter. There was also the desire to earn the money from the deal. There was a degree of indeterminacy prior to her decision. When she did decide, however, she made one set of reasons or motives prevail over the others by the act of deciding. Kane calls this pure voluntary control, which is the ability to bring about whichever one of the options that you will, when you will, to do so. It is voluntary because while she did not wish to be put in such a situation, there was no one coercing her to take any particular course of action. If there was someone pointing a gun to her head to make her go seal the deal, for instance, then the primary conflict would then be between her will and the coercer's will, rather than a conflict within her own will, prompted by the circumstances. I want to go to John Paul Sartre's example in a public lecture he delivered, which I think better shows what is at stake in pure rationality. Sartre's student asked him, during the time of the Second World War, if he should go fight for France as a soldier or remain home with his ailing mother who depended on him. Both alternatives are rational and attractive in their own way. If he becomes a soldier, he can defend his homeland, but if he stayed home, he will offer comfort to his sick mother. Both of the options are desired by the agent, but they were incommensurable since he could not be in two places at the same time, and hence he had to choose. Kane describes the reciprocal support that choices and reasons have for each other. Reasons influence the choice made, while the choice itself, once made, connects the reasons to the intention formed, so that the reason for choosing also becomes reasons for acting. Once a choice had been made, the reasons for that choice help the agent persist in her actions to carry out that choice. Kane suggests that the choice reorganizes the motivation structure of the brain, creating connections between the neural patterns corresponding to the agent's reasons for that choice and neural patterns corresponding to the intention created by that choice. These connections propel actions towards the intention. Hence, the reasons play a causal and also teleological role. He proposes a biological mechanism of superposition of brainwaves for this decision-making. The self-network is the function of the brain that models the person's higher-order self in terms of her plans, aspirations, and ideals, and the motivational structures which influence and guide practical reasoning and action. It has its own wave pattern. When a choice is being made, each of the alternatives would have their own reason network with their own wave patterns. These interact with the self-network, superimposing on the self-network's wave pattern. The competing reason network with a resultant highest amplitude will be the favored reasons leading to the choice which these reasons support. This biological mechanism supports the notion that the effort of the will and choices made are our own, a product of ourselves. Kane believes that this mechanism he proposes is not just required by libertarians, but in keeping with the free agency principle, is a mechanism determinists will also require to account for how an agent is propelled towards her determined action. The essential difference between the libertarians and the determinists on the self-network hypothesis is that the wave pattern of the self-network for the libertarians will involve chaotic indeterminacies, such that the choice will be undetermined. The choice remains indeterminate until the moment it is made. Because of the indeterminacies arising from the quantum level and then amplified at the neuronal and brain system level due to chaos, it is not known before the decision what the decision is. It follows that agents are thus not determined by their past and retain control over their future lives. Free will is limited by genetic and environmental factors and social conditioning. These have an influence on our characters and motives that form our self-network, which then influences the choices we make. However, while there is an influence, this influence is not totalizing such that it makes these choices determined. Every free choice, which is a self-forming willing, is the initiation of a value experiment whose justification lies in the future and is not fully explained by the past, writes Kane. It is influenced by the past but not determined by it. Free agents are both authors of and characters in their own stories all at once, he says. There is a teleological intelligibility, a narrative continuity, a coherence in the story of our lives which we take responsibility for creating. It is not merely physical descriptions linked by causal relations, the way a determinist might believe it is. While Kane explains that we need not be mind-body dualists to understand his theory, we cannot be reductive materialists either. Not everything about our experiences, thoughts, and actions are reducible to physical-chemical relations. If we do not accept that higher-level phenomena can emerge from the physical realm, then we are in effect eliminating the possibility for free will, but also consciousness, purpose, and mental action, which will be also a problem for determinists. Kane posits that the reason why free will seems to be an intractable problem is due to its relation to two cosmological problems, both of which confront determinists and indeterminists alike. 1. The problem of consciousness, and 2. Indeterminacy in nature. The problem of consciousness questions how thoughts and other conscious processes can be physical brain processes. The problem of indeterminacy in nature asks how fundamental particles in nature can have indeterminate trajectories in which their position and momentum cannot be both exact at the same time, which is Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Why is there indeterminacy at the quantum level? While science at the moment has no answer, Kane suggests that the puzzlement and skepticism by scientists on the matter is instructive for thinkers on free will. Just as indeterminate trajectories and properties force us to view the physical world in strange and novel ways, he writes, indeterminate efforts force us to view human actions and life histories in unaccustomed ways. Whenever new ways of thinking about what may seem familiar emerge, they face resistance, but that should not stop us. Kane has hypothesized a possible biological mechanism to understand free will, which connects consciousness with quantum indeterminacy. Kane has dealt with moral and prudential choices to describe the functionings of free will, but efforts of the will are required also to sustain our purposes. We need to make efforts of will in our chosen activities such as games, work, art, and thinking to counteract laziness and loss of focus. We need to make efforts of will to carry out tasks we dislike or fear, like going to the dentist or touching a snake. These efforts are indeterminate since we have the alternative of giving up or giving in to our baser inclinations. Like in the case of moral and prudential choices, these conflicts create tension, which is reflected in the brain's shift further from thermodynamic equilibrium. Other instances requiring effort of will are A. The choice of omission when the decision is to delay making a decision. B. Attentional efforts where we make effort to direct our attention so as to focus on a matter or to strengthen our resolve. C. Practical deliberation and creative problem solving where undetermined ideas pop into our heads by chance, suggesting new possibilities which we test by making thought experiments with them. D. Endorsement of reasons or motives where the chance ideas that come to us are judged by us as relevant or irrelevant. E. Taoist efforts, where the agent makes effort to relax their minds so as to relinquish conscious control over thought processes, to allow themselves to have new thoughts and images that may well up from the unconscious. F. The juror analogy, where we try to consider as many relevant factors as possible, so as to be sure we have deliberated thoroughly over the alternatives before making a decision, to avoid deciding hastily the way jurors should do. When to stop deliberating is also a decision point. These efforts of will play a role in deliberation, whether it is over moral, prudential, or practical matters. Indeterminacy is present when the effort is being made and is resolved upon the point of decision, even though it may be renewed. For instance, when doubt creeps in over whether the right decision has been made, sparking a new round of deliberation involving efforts of will. Indeterminacy has metaphysical implications. Kane points out that two possible worlds with exactly the same past may not have the same future, since the agents in both worlds have different indeterminacies leading to different free choices and outcomes, making them unique individuals rather than the same individuals, just in two similar worlds. The individual cannot be exactly duplicated. But does that mean that it is simply chance and luck driving how things turn out? Kane distinguishes between chance and indeterminacy. Epicurus, an ancient Greek philosopher, postulates that atoms have a swerve that is dependent on chance, hence introducing uncertainty into the cosmos and opening the possibility for free will. However, he is mistaken, since chance occurrences are in fact antithetical to the control of free will, since chance is not within anyone's control. In a world where there is free will, there will be an indeterminate gestation period where choices remain indeterminate, while in Epicurus's world, whatever happens just pops out from the other determined events. To properly understand a world with free will, it is not just by adding chance to an otherwise deterministic world, but one where indeterminacy is woven more deeply into the fabric of reality, such as a quantum indeterministic world where probability plays a role. The probability of an agent choosing between two alternatives is related to the agent's present character and motives. One who is strong-willed on moral issues will have a higher probability of choosing the moral alternative, for instance in the case of the businesswoman, to help the victims of assault. However, there remains a low probability that she will give in to her self-interest to seal the business deal instead. With probabilities, no outcome is guaranteed. There remains the probability that she would succumb to her self-interest, while for a weak-willed person, there remains the probability, albeit a low one, of her conquering her moral weakness and choosing the moral alternative. For both alternatives, there are competing motivations with their own sets of reasons, and hence, whichever is chosen, the outcome is rational. This makes agents morally responsible for their choices, since they were ultimately responsible for their self-forming willings for those events which contributed to their character development. Their character, built through the self-forming willings over time, influence the choices they make in the present, though they do not determine them. The degree of the influence is reflected in the probabilities of how they would choose. With each choice, say to resist temptation and act morally, the agent becomes more moral, and conversely, if the agent keeps giving in to temptation, the character becomes increasingly morally weakened. Moral responsibility accumulates over time, notes Kane. According to a 2020 survey of philosophers, compatibilism is the most widely accepted position on the free will debate, with libertarianism a distant second. Prior to the discovery of fundamental indeterminacy in nature, the determinists had the upper hand, since cause and effect was the natural law par excellence. But with quantum indeterminacy now firmly established as scientific fact, determinacy has to somehow minimally account for probabilistic effects rather than certain ones. It has certainly brought libertarianism back into play, and Kane has contributed to this by presenting a compelling case for this position. His approach is methodologically sound, since it insists on only using concepts that will also be acceptable to determinists and compatibilists, which he terms the free agency principle. He examines contemporary neuroscience and physics to hypothesize a plausible mechanism of how the brain may have indeterminate processes arising from quantum indeterminacy at the neuronal level, which then allows for indeterminacy in our decision-making processes. This biological description corresponds to the phenomenological experience of tension and struggle when we make efforts of the will during decision-making. While the state of neuroscience has developed further in the 27 years since the publication of The Significance of Free Will, Kane's argument for free will do not critically rely on whether he got the biological mechanism of brain functions exactly right. Indeterminacy at the quantum level has made possible a break from determinism, which draws its strength from the seemingly ineluctable laws of cause and effect. Whatever the details of the neural mechanism, so long as it allows for indeterministic effects, Kane's broader arguments cannot be ruled out. If we can accept that consciousness can emerge in sufficiently high-order species from the complex organization of their material bodies, then it is not a big step from there to conceive that free will can emerge from consciousness. Kane makes some important insights into our decision-making processes. We are not just moral or prudential robots who will always make the most moral or prudential decision. We have also reasons for self-interested acts and immediate gratification, which are incommensurable with moral and prudential reasons. And so when we choose for those reasons, we remain rational in our choices. His theory accounts for how not all decisions need to be undetermined, just the ones in which we form our character through self-forming willings, after which our character can influence or even determine the choices we make. If we have the freedom to form our characters through those possibly rare but critical self-forming willings, then we have ultimate responsibility for our decisions manifested in our acts of will. Kane's 91 thesis, however, is not the last word on the matter. As he had noted, there remains the two cosmological problems of consciousness and indeterminacy in nature, which has to be tackled by scientists and free will thinkers, whatever position they may hold. While quantum indeterminacy may have opened up a space to insert indeterminism, Kane's biological mechanism only gives us suggestions on how it might work, but it is unclear how superposition of reason networks onto the self-network, which has neuronal quantum indeterminacies, translate to the controlling power of the will to freely decide. In fact, it smacks of epiphenomena, though I doubt that's Kane's intention. The reason why it seems epiphenomenic is because there remains a gap that is unexplained. Kane's work provides some broad directions that can guide the scientific investigation into consciousness and free will. More scientific work will now need to be done to understand consciousness and quantum indeterminacy to cover this gap, which can then inform philosophy. The quest continues, as it must, since the notion of free will is so central to human identity and dignity. In the immortal words of David Hilbert, we must know, we will know. Thank you.